The War series is a collection of turn-based strategy games that originated in 1988, with the first game in the series being Famicom Wars. The series saw several more installments over the following years, all of which were launched in Japan exclusively. But on September 10th, 2001, the Western market finally got its chance to experience this beloved series with the North American release of Advance Wars for the Game Boy Advance. The game was set to debut in Europe and Japan later that year, but just one day after the North American launch, the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened, delaying the upcoming release dates. Advance Wars was later released in Europe in January of 2002. And the game was a huge success in the Western world. It received immediate universal acclaim and went on to acquire a dedicated following. Some in the industry even credit the success of Advance Wars as the driving force for bringing other historically Japanese exclusive games, such as Fire Emblem, to the Western market. Soon, several different online forums dedicated solely to Advance Wars began to pop up online. These sites served as a gathering place where fans from all over the world could connect and share their knowledge and love for the game. One of these sites was called AW Bunker. And unfortunately, this would be where two innocent people would cross paths with a monster. David Heiss was born on June 19, 1987 in Frankfurt, Germany. He had quite a turbulent childhood, beginning very soon after his mother and father divorced. After his parents split, David was sent to live with his grandparents near Limburg. And his mother soon found a new husband and had more children, and despite living very close to where her son was living, she rarely ever visited or called David. So their relationship became very distant and very strained. And David's relationship with his father was even more distant. They had almost no contact at all after the divorce. His parents had seemingly removed David from the picture so they could move on and create new lives for themselves. And even though David was very close to his grandparents, he always felt that sense of abandonment. And this caused him to become even more removed and isolated from the world. He became very insecure and always felt like he didn't fit in, and as he moved into his teenage years, David was almost reclusive aside from his school obligations. And often in cases where children feel isolated from their physical world, they tend to thrust themselves into the online world. And David was spending up to 8 hours per day online by the time he was a teenager. Even though David had a hard time making relationships and making friends, he was academically gifted. He was very intelligent, and he had dreams of going to college whenever he graduated. But unfortunately, he had no money for tuition, and he wasn't getting any kind of support from his parents. So going to college was kind of not on the table for him. So with college now off the table, David decides to go into the military. So at age 19, he enlists. But after serving only 2 weeks in the military, David was discharged for being mentally unfit to serve. So with that option now also off the table, David decides it's time to get a job. He gets a job working as an apprentice in a textile company. And then in 2007, David received another crushing blow when his grandfather passed away. David's grandparents had been the only real constant in his life, and now he's lost part of that. So all of that sense of abandonment, the insecurities that he has, it's only exacerbated by the death of his grandfather. And he retreats even further into himself and into the internet. And it would be around this time that David joins the AW Bunker forum and becomes a very active member of the community there. And this is where David first meets 20-year-old Matthew Pyke and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Joanna Whitten. Matthew Pyke was a former physics student who had moved over from the Suffolk area of England to Nottingham and was planning to enroll at Nottingham Trent University to continue his studies. Matthew was living with his girlfriend Joanna in a flat above a pub called the Orange Tree in the city center of Nottingham. Joanna was a student at the local university studying environmental science. Both Joanna and Matthew were very active on the Advance Wars websites and contributed often in the AW Bunker forum. Very soon after Joanna and Matthew meet David Heiss on the AW Bunker forum, the website actually ended up shutting down. And so this prompted Joanna and Matthew to start up their own Advance Wars website that they called Wars Central. So David Heiss, along with several other contributors on the AW Bunker forum, decide to move over to War Central. So most of you, I'm sure, already know this, but whenever you're members of these forums, you typically have a username or an alias that you go by. In this case, Joanna was known as JoJo, Matthew was known as Shade, and David Heiss was known as Eagle the Lightning. Joanna and Matthew manage the forums themselves, along with one other person, and David Heiss becomes a very active member of the War Central community. He contributes all the time. David Heiss at this point, of course, is still reeling from the death of his grandfather. He's already an introverted person. He's already someone that really seeks solace in an online community. And this tendency really ramped up around this time when the War Central website was getting started, and David becomes completely obsessed with this forum. He's a very prevalent, common presence on this forum. And David Heiss very quickly becomes obsessed with Joanna. He just loved everything about this girl. He loved the fact that she had red hair. He felt like it made her more intelligent than other people. He loved the fact that she was a girl gamer, someone who was so into Advance Wars, which is something he was super into. This really attracted him to her. And not only did she play Advance Wars and was really into the game, but she was also a leader in the online community. And this just made David feel like Joanna was his soulmate, that she was the absolute perfect girl for him. So his online obsession with Joanna started out on the War Central forum, and then it started to slowly escalate as time goes on. David begins going through all of her social media accounts, going through all of her photos and everything, and he knows that she is with Matthew Pike. He understands that there's a roadblock there for him. But that doesn't stop David from sending Joanna inappropriate messages through her social media accounts. One of the messages read, "I love you, JoJo, more than anything else in my life. I shouldn't, but I can't help it. And to be honest, it's a great feeling." So Joanna, trying to let him down easily, she tries to just kind of dismiss it. She does it in a nice way, but she does try to let him know, I don't feel the same way as you. This isn't okay what you're doing. But this actually only deepened David's obsession with Joanna, and then his thoughts begin to turn very dark. He sends another online friend a message that read, "Seriously, the whole thing will end with at least one of us three dying." And this was, of course, in reference to himself, Matthew, and Joanna. So David is obviously getting frustrated with the way things are going with Joanna. So he decides that the best course of action is for him to go visit Matthew and Joanna. So David ends up getting Joanna and Matthew's address from a mutual online friend. So then this friend ends up texting Joanna to let her know that David Heiss is planning to come see her in person. But Joanna and Matthew didn't really believe that this was something that would actually happen. I think that they were still in denial about how serious this was actually becoming. But then on June 21st, 2008, Joanna and Matthew get a knock at the door. And sure enough, when they open the door, there stands David Heiss. Joanna and Matthew are completely stunned by what's going on here. They couldn't believe that David Heiss is standing on their doorstep. So, not wanting to seem rude, Matthew invites David inside and lets him in, but Joanna immediately has alarm bells going off. She doesn't feel comfortable with this situation at all. So Matthew and David go into the living room and they start watching football on TV and just kind of talking and hanging out. Meanwhile, Joanna is in the next room trying desperately to find a hostel that has an opening for David so that she can send him there. So she's calling and she's calling and she's calling, and nowhere near them has any availability. So out of pity, Joanna and Matthew let David spend the night in their apartment. Matthew and Joanna's apartment is pretty small though, and there's really not a whole lot of space in their apartment. So when David spends the night, he actually has to sleep on the floor of Joanna and Matthew's bedroom. And Joanna was so uncomfortable that entire night. She hardly slept at all. She spent most of the night just kind of lying awake, glancing around the room, and every time she would glance down towards the floor where David was lying, she said he would just be staring straight up at her. This was really creeping Joanna out. So the next morning, she and Matthew kind of have a talk, and they decide that David needs to find somewhere else to stay the next day. So in an attempt to get David away from them, they suggest that he go visit some of the other forum members. So they contact some of the other contributors on their website, and they let them know that David's in the area and that he's going to be traveling around and making visits. And so they send him on his way. David spent some time kind of traveling around, going to meet these different people that he had built these friendships with on the Wars Central forum. And he's getting to finally meet them face to face. So, that keeps him busy for a while. But all the other members found David kind of odd. He didn't want to talk about the game. He didn't want to talk about anything really except for Joanna. They would say that he spent the entire visit just talking about her, and they found this extremely unsettling. So at this point, a lot of the forum members are now talking about David behind his back, about David's weird behavior. And word is just kind of spreading pretty quickly in their online community that David Heiss just isn't right. There's something odd about him, something that collectively they all felt was just off. In the end, David ends up spending about 3 weeks in the UK before he returns home to Germany. Word of all this gets back to Matthew and Joanna that all David did was obsessively talk about Joanna. He's really starting to realize that David Heiss does not have good intentions here, and he's becoming very uncomfortable with how fixated David is on his girlfriend. And Matthew is understandably really upset about this. He felt like David was showing blatant disrespect for his and Joanna's relationship. So Matthew decides to retaliate, and he ends up writing this really long post on the Wars Central website titled "The 19 Reasons Why I Hate David Heiss." And essentially what this post was is just a way to call David out for everything that Matthew had discovered about him. And part of this document read, "I hate you because you decided to come into our lives. I hate you for ever laying eyes on the girl I have dedicated my life to. I hate you for your desperation." When David saw this post, it sent him into a total rage. This just completely escalated his hatred for Matthew Pyke to a whole other level. He's now obsessing over hurting Matthew Pyke. He tells a friend online that he has fantasies of grabbing Matthew Pyke by the back of the head and just smashing his head repeatedly into a wall. He's obviously reaching a breaking point mentally. So just 13 days after arriving home from his trip to the UK, David decides that it's absolutely necessary that he take another trip to England. So he borrows a car from his uncle, and he decides he's going to drive there. And this is a very long drive. This is over 600 miles. And David makes it almost all the way to Nottingham, but he ends up getting into a car accident on the way there on the morning of August 1st. And he suffers minor injuries and actually has to go to the hospital. But this didn't stop David. The next day, he was released from the hospital. He immediately catches a train and heads towards Nottingham. And he makes his way towards Joanna and Matthew's home. And on his way to Joanna and Matthew's apartment, Joanna actually spots David on the street, and she immediately freaks out. And as far as I know, David ended up going back to Germany right after Joanna spotted him on the street. And this was really a pivotal moment. I think they both really understood just how serious this was becoming. Joanna sends him a message essentially urging him to seek help from a psychiatrist. But he responds to this by sending Joanna a message that read, "Joe, one day I will break my promise and come back to Nottingham and offer you a knife or something and tell you to kill me, because I don't want to live without you." So, of course, they decide first things first, they need to ban him from their website. This is where most of their interactions happen. That would be the obvious place to start. So they ban him from their forum. Joanna also cuts off any social media contact with him as well. And when David realizes that he's been banned from the forum and that all of his contact with Joanna has pretty much been cut at this point, again, he just flies into a rage. And he feels like the one and only person to blame for that is Matthew Pyke. So he starts putting all of his thoughts into figuring out a way to get rid of Matthew. And a couple of months go by without any attempted contact from David, but then in early September, Matthew receives an email from him that read, "There's something I would like to give you. I'm not going to say what it is though. You will love it." So on September 18th, 2008, 21-year-old David Heiss sets his evil plan into action. He packs a suitcase with lots of warm clothes, a sleeping bag to keep him comfortable while he slept outdoors, a pair of gardening gloves, a suicide note, and a knife. He then takes a flight from Frankfurt, Germany to Birmingham, and then takes a train to Nottingham. So once he's in Nottingham, he heads straight for Joanna and Matthew's building, but he doesn't go in. He doesn't try to alert anyone that he's there. Instead, he finds a comfortable spot next to an air conditioning unit outside, and he gets out his sleeping bag and he falls asleep, just meters away from where Joanna and Matthew are obliviously sitting in their apartment. No clue that this threat to them is right outside their door. The next morning, Joanna gets up, gets ready for work, kisses Matthew goodbye, walks out the door and out of the building. And as she's walking away, David Heiss is watching her. This is his cue to head into the building. David walks into the building, up the stairs, and knocks on Joanna and Matthew's door. Matthew opens up the door, and as soon as he does, David begins his attack. He pushes Matthew into the apartment and begins repeatedly stabbing him. Matthew tries his hardest to get away from David, but David had the upper hand from the beginning. And in the end, David stabbed Matthew a total of 86 times. Now, David has to think fast here because his original plan was to make this look like a suicide. He brought the suicide letter with him to the apartment that day to make it look like Matthew had killed himself. But this was a frenzied attack. No one was ever going to believe that this was something Matthew had done to himself. So now David has to figure out a plan B. So he decides that his best option is to try to make the apartment look like it had been robbed. He starts pulling out clothes, knocking things on the floor, just completely trashing the place. He also takes some items from the home that he's going to dispose of later just to really, try to make it look like this was an actual robbery. So now it's time to flee the scene, but David has another problem. His shoes are completely soaked in Matthew's blood, and he forgot to bring a backup pair. So what does he do? He borrows a pair of shoes from Matthew, the person that he's just brutally murdered. He takes a pair of Matthew's shoes and forces them on his very large feet and walks out the door. David can actually be seen on CCTV footage walking pigeon-toed because the shoes that he had taken from Matthew didn't fit him, and he had also cut himself during the attack. So David then calmly heads to the airport in Birmingham and boards his plane and heads back home to Germany. So in total, he was in the UK for less than 16 hours, and he managed to commit this absolutely horrendous crime in that short amount of time. So at this point, I'm imagining David just calmly sitting on his flight home, happy with himself that he actually had the courage to go through with what he's done to Matthew and eliminate this problem that he's had in his life. And he's thinking that he's covered all of his bases and he's just gotten away with the perfect murder. But what David didn't know is that while he was busy ransacking the apartment to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, thinking Matthew Pike was dead in the next room, Matthew was actually still alive, and he used the last little ounce of energy that he had left to write the letters DAV on the side of his computer monitor in his own blood. He likely knew that he wasn't going to make it, and he wanted to make sure that there would be absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind who had done this to him. So by the end of Joanna's workday, she is realizing that she hadn't spoken to Matthew at all that day, and she's starting to become a little worried. So she leaves work quickly, she heads straight home, and unfortunately walks into an absolutely horrific scene. So she immediately calls 999 and tells police what she's seeing. They come to the apartment so that they can start their investigation. And Joanna's actually taken into the station for questioning. The case is handed over to Detective Tony Hayden, and he describes this scene as one of the worst he's ever seen. While at the station, of course, the detectives are asking Joanna if Matthew has any enemies or anyone that might want to hurt him. And so that's when Joanna Joanna starts telling the detective about all the issues that she's been having with David Heiss. Detectives are putting these pieces together pretty much immediately that David Heiss is likely the person that's done this to Matthew. The information that Joanna gives them, coupled with the letters DAV that they had found on the computer monitor at the scene of the crime, pretty much confirmed to police that David Heiss is the person that they needed to investigate first. So they've got to build their case, they've got to prove it, and they don't know where David lives. They know that he lives somewhere in Germany, but they're not sure, what part of Germany that he lives in. Police begin speaking to other forum members to see if anyone has any, useful information about where they could find David Heiss. But the only real piece of information that they were able to obtain is that he lived somewhere in the Frankfurt area of Germany. But they were also told by other forum members that he was seen online the day of the murder. And what police didn't know at the time is that Heiss asked his sister to log onto his account while he was gone.
The computer.
So in a very clumsy attempt to make it look like he was oblivious to everything and completely removed from the issue, David Heiss starts asking members of the forum if they've seen or heard from Matthew lately. And then just 4 days after Matthew Pike was murdered, Joanna receives a Facebook message from David. "I will pray for you, Joe. You must be suffering unbelievable pains. I'm sorry for having caused so much trouble lately. I hope you won't lose all your hope. We will be there for you." And he believes that this is somehow going to make Joanna just fall into his arms and use him as some sort of emotional support. And this just goes to show how completely socially unaware David Heiss is. The investigation kind of hit like a little bit of a roadblock whenever they really just couldn't pinpoint where exactly David Heiss lived. But they ended up getting a breakthrough when they find out that he was in a car accident in England in August. Remember whenever he went the second time to England and he got into that car accident? Well, all that stuff was on file. The wreckage crew ended up having to send some of David Heiss's belongings that he had left in the car. They had to mail them back to him in Germany. So now they had an address. And now police could finally serve David with an arrest warrant. But unfortunately, this arrest warrant wasn't as straightforward as it normally would be. These are two different countries that they were dealing with. David didn't live in the UK, he lived in Germany. So because of this, detectives in England had to go through Europol. So when they started the process of going through Europol, that put the UK detectives in touch with the German detectives. And the two agencies began working together to track down David Heiss. And on September 24th, 2008, German authorities arrested David Heiss at his home. He didn't put up a fight. He went willingly with the detectives. And once he was at the station, he just started talking. He opened up about everything. He opened up about falling in love with Joanna, his obsession with her, and his hatred for Matthew. He told them all about the trips that he had taken to the UK and the fight that he had had with Matthew. He tells them about all the drama that had been going down on the War's Central Forum. But this is where David started twisting things. He was willing to admit to murdering Matthew. He wasn't going to deny that he had done that. But he tried to make it sound like he murdered Matthew in self-defense. He tells them that he went to Matthew's apartment that day with the intention of punishing him and talking to him about all the online bullying that he was going through, but that he was not going there to kill him. And then he tells them that Matthew attacked him first, and that's why he started stabbing him. But the crime scene told a totally different story. It was clear to police that there had been a prolonged, repeated attack on Matthew, and it started as soon as he opened the front door. And Matthew had been stabbed 86 times. This was not self-defense. David started talking at 10 p.m. and didn't stop until 3 a.m. The day after David was arrested, Detective Tony Hayden traveled to Germany. There he met German authorities, and they all went over to David's house so that the German authorities could show Tony all the evidence that they had found in David's home. And they pull out this suitcase from underneath David's bed. On November 25th, 2008, David Heiss was extradited to England to face murder charges. And no one showed up to support David throughout the trial. And during the trial, David was put on the stand and he spent 2 whole days blaming Matthew for everything that happened. He was still pushing the self-defense narrative. But prosecution was able to very easily prove that this story just wasn't true and that this was just cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The jury was able to see the self-defense wounds on Matthew's hands, all the blood spatter that was all over the apartment, the CCTV footage that they had of David disposing of things and waiting outside of the apartment, the letters DAV that Matthew had written in his own blood on the computer monitor. This was all enough evidence for the jury to very confidently convict David Heiss of murder. So on May 11th, 2009, the jury found David Heiss guilty of murder after only 2.5 hours of deliberation, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole until 18 years has been served. Matthew Pyke was only 20 years old when his life was taken from him. He had built this wonderful, happy life with his girlfriend Joanna, and they were really just getting started. And it's really sad to think about where he would be today if they would have never met David Heiss. And that's it for today's case. Thank you so much for watching. And if you found this video interesting or educational in any way, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel. See you next time.